Picture this. So you're walking down the street or you're driving down the street, whatever you're doing, and you see a homeless person talking to themselves, as they often do. And maybe they're gesturing wildly. You know, their hands are flailing around. Looks like they're having a heated conversation with someone who isn't there. You might think, what's wrong with them? You know, their reality doesn't make sense to you. But here's the twist. What if your reality isn't as solid as you think? What if the way you see the world, your choices, your opinions, even your sense of self is built on a collection of assumptions shaped by your brain, by your experiences, and your biases? What if it's just as subjective as theirs? And that's what we're diving into today. The philosophical question, is your reality real? Welcome to Breaking Barriers with Alan Stafford, the personal development podcast where we break through mental blocks, challenge limiting beliefs, and overcome societal barriers. Get ready for actionable insights and strategies to help you redefine success and unlock your true potential. All right, our brains, they're pretty incredible storytellers, and we're going to talk about that today. But they take the brain, that is, they take incomplete information and weave it into a narrative that makes, sense to us. And it feels real because, it has to. Our survival depends on it, right? But here's the catch, folks. The narrative is shaped by so many factors. I mean, your past experiences, societal norms, and even cognitive shortcuts your brain takes to save time and energy. And while this storytelling is essential for making sense of the world, it also means that the reality you experience is deeply personal and, not entirely objective. And this isn't just, an interesting concept. It's vital for personal growth. And why, you ask? Well, because I don't know if you asked why, but I'm asking why. Because when we blindly accept our version of reality without questioning it, we lock ourselves basically into certain ways of thinking, certain decisions, and even certain beliefs about who we are. So if we want to grow, if we want to think critically and basically live authentically, we have to ask, is this really true? Does my version of reality serve me, or is it holding me back? So by the end of today's episode, what I'm hoping you gain is some powerful tools to help you question your version of reality and expand the way you think. See, what we'll do is we'll explore how perception shapes the world you see. We'll explore the role of cognitive biases, or what cognitive biases play in distorting that world, and practical strategies to challenge your assumptions and see the bigger picture. So whether you're navigating personal growth, making tough decisions, or just trying to understand yourself better, I'm hoping this episode will give you the tools to start seeing the world and yourself in a whole new way. So let's start by looking at what reality is and how your brain shapes it. All right, folks, before we dive into how your brain basically shapes reality, what we need to do is set the stage for defining what reality actually is, okay? Understanding what it is. And here's where things get, interesting. There are two ways we can think about reality: objective and subjective. So objective reality is basically the external world, the facts, events, and, physical things that exist independently of how we perceive them. For example, a tree outside your window is there whether or not you're looking at it. It's real in an objective sense. And the thing is that there is a debate raging whether objective reality even exists or not. In fact, there was a quantum experiment a few years ago that it repeated an earlier experiment from the early 1960s, and the conclusion of that recent study upheld the one of the 1960s, basically arguing that objective reality does not exist. But here's the catch, folks. For the purposes of our episode today, objective reality does not really matter for the sake of our discussion, because what we experience as reality is mostly subjective. It's how we interpret and make sense of the world around us. You see, our feelings, thoughts, and perceptions all shape this personal version of reality for us. Two people can stand in front of the same tree, that same tree we're talking about, but one might see it as a symbol of strength, while the other sees it as a hazard waiting to fall. I mean, they might have had that bad experience in the past, but the tree itself hasn't changed, but the reality has. And this distinction between the world as it exists and the world as, well, we experience it is at the heart of today's topic. You see, the way we experience reality is shaped by filters in our brain. And those filters can vary wildly from person to person. And I'm not talking about like physical filters. I'm talking about how we view things and see things and perceive things. Those are the filters I'm talking about. Let me give you a little fun example that might sound familiar. Remember the infamous the infamous blue and gold dress debate that went viral, I don't know, maybe some 10, 15 years ago. And if you don't, I'll have it in the show notes. You can see it there on my website, alanstafford.com. See, some people swore the dress was blue and black, while others were convinced it was white and gold. Personally, I thought it was blue and black myself. I couldn't see the blue or the white and gold, but I can see the blue and black. In that same dress, the same image, but it was completely different realities. You see, people were seeing two different things. It was even on the news. And I remember there was a big debate, and people were arguing over their own perceptions, meaning those who saw it as blue and gold were arguing with those who saw it as blue and black and saying, no, it's blue and gold. But in reality, you were experiencing two different realities, two different perceptions of the same, as we would like to say, objective dress. Or how about the Laurel Yanni audio illusion? You know, some people heard Laurel, others heard Yanni, and some could hear both depending on how they focused their attention. Again, the same exact input, but entirely different experiences of it. And these examples might seem like harmless internet debates, but they reveal something profound about us. What we perceive isn't just based on the information we take in. It's shaped by how our brain processes and interprets that information. And that's where things get really interesting. And I'll have links to these studies and information in the show notes on my website, as I've said, alanstafford.com, or you can follow the link provided on the podcast platform where you're listening to this podcast at. So how does the brain decide what reality looks, sounds, or even feels like? Let's break this down, okay? Your brain, that's that thing on top of your head, that 3-pound organ. Your brain is constantly flooded with sensory input. I mean, we're talking light hitting your eyes, sound reaching your ears, and sensations on your skin. But here's the thing, folks. It's impossible for your brain to process all of that raw data at once. So it takes what's called shortcuts. What it does is it filters the information based on what's most relevant, your past experiences, your expectations, and even the context you're in. You know, what's happening around you right then and there. If you're at an amusement park, if you're hiking, or if you're at home, or if you're in an argument. And this process happens so seamlessly that you don't even realize it's happening. But it means that what you see or hear isn't the full picture. It's the version of the picture your brain decides is most useful for you at that moment. That's pretty fascinating, isn't it? And if you think about it that way, you begin to think that everybody is different. And no two people experience the same thing. But it's at this intersection where we have different experiences where we introduce a very interesting part of the brain called the default mode network, DMN. And the DMN is active when a person is not focused on external stimuli and is instead thinking internally, meaning the default mode network in your brain occurs when you're not focused. Okay, and so this can include daydreaming, mind wandering when your mind wanders, or self-reflection, and recalling personal experiences as well. So think of it as your brain's storyteller, if you will. It's the system that takes all those incomplete bits of information and weaves them into a coherent narrative that makes sense to you. The DMN, default mode network, is basically suppressed when you're focused on external stimuli, but not suppressed when you're unfocused, when you're not thinking about it. For example, if you hear a strange noise at night, your brain might instantly fill in the gaps because you're not focused on that strange noise. You're just sitting there. Maybe you're focused on reading and you hear the strange noise and your brain fills in the gap and it says, well, that's probably the wind, or maybe it's someone at the door. Maybe it's someone trying to get in my house and get me. But whatever it is, it's filling that gap. And even if you don't have all the facts, your default mode network creates a story to help you make sense of what's happening. But here's the catch. This storytelling doesn't always reflect objective reality. Sometimes it reflects your fears, biases, or assumptions instead. And that's why two people can experience this exact same situation in a completely different way. Their brains are filtering and interpreting the world through entirely unique lenses, folks. And that's really important to understand when you're having a conversation with someone, because they're coming to you with a different set of filters, basically a different set of biases and experiences. And so their version of reality isn't wrong. It just may not coincide with your version of reality, but it doesn't make it wrong. So reality isn't as clear-cut as we like to think, basically. There's the objective world out there, but our experience of it is deeply personal. And it's shaped by our brain's filters, as I've said, in the shortcuts, and basically the narratives we tell ourselves. But what happens when those filters distort the truth? How does your brain sometimes lie to you? And what can you do about it? That's what we'll dive into next. Okay, so let's talk about one of the biggest culprits behind distorted thinking, and that's cognitive biases. And you may have heard of that before, maybe you haven't, but you're hearing about it now. You see, cognitive biases are basically mental shortcuts. They're quick ways for our brain, or for your brain, anybody's brain, to process the massive amount of information that deals with every second. And folks, there's something like 11 million bits of information that your subconscious is processing, but only 40 to 50 bits for the conscious mind. So only 40 to 50 bits of information is being processed by your conscious mind, but your unconscious mind, 11 million bits of information. That's a lot of information coming at you. And on the surface, these shortcuts, well, they're helpful because you see how much information you're processing. They basically save us time, conserve our mental energy, and help make decisions quickly. But here's the problem, folks. These shortcuts often lead to flawed conclusions. They can twist your perception of reality, making you see the world in a way that isn't necessarily true or even helpful. So let's dig into 3 common cognitive biases that might be influencing how you see the world right now without even realizing it. First, there's a confirmation bias. And if you've listened to other episodes of the podcast, it's something I talk about quite often. And it's one of the biggest biases out there. Confirmation bias basically is the tendency to look for, interpret, and remember information in a way that supports what you already believe. It's like your brain is wearing blinders, only noticing things that reinforce its existing story. So if you have these preconceived ideas about the world or certain topics, confirmation bias helps you seek out stories that confirm what you already believe. So, for example, if you believe you're bad at public speaking, you're more likely to remember the one awkward presentation you might have given at work or in school or wherever than the 5 times that you did really well. I've been there before. I tend to focus in the past on that one bad presentation I gave, despite the other 20 or 30 that were very good. And then I go, well, I'm not good at public speaking. And that's confirmation bias because I'm looking at that one. I'm not looking at the other 5, 10, 20, whatever presentations I've done. Or think about politics. People tend to follow news sources that align with their views. That's why you have, news stations like Fox News or MSNBC, 2 opposites. And basically when they do this, they're creating echo chambers that reinforces their beliefs instead of challenging them. They're seeking out like-minded individuals, reinforcing their confirmation or confirming their biases about what they already think about in politics. And what are the results? You're stuck in a bubble where your reality feels solid, but it's actually just a reflection of what you want to see, not what the world is objectively saying or showing. Does that make sense? Can you grasp that concept of confirmation bias? It's a really important one, too. Okay, next up is anchoring bias. And this happens when you rely too heavily on the first piece of information you encounter, or as they say, the anchor when making decisions. So let's say you're shopping for a car, and this is one car dealers use a lot too, or salespeople in general. So let's say you're shopping for a car, and the first salesperson you meet quotes you $30,000, which seems to be reasonably cheap nowadays for a car, but they quote you $30,000. Even if you later see a similar car for $25,000, that initial $30,000 figure sticks in your mind, making the cheaper car seem like a better deal because that $30,000 was the first price anchored to your thinking. It makes the $25,000 car look cheaper, or makes it look like a better deal, even if $25,000 is still more than you wanted to spend. So anchoring bias can influence everything from how we negotiate salaries to how we evaluate opportunities, simply because the first piece of information sets the tone. And good salespeople, like I said, use anchoring bias to their advantage. So if a salesperson might say something like, might be selling you something for $1,000 and you ask them the price, they might go, wow, it's $5,000. Then they go, nah, just kidding, it's $1,000. Now what they've done is they've anchored you to the 5,000, and then you look at 1,000 as a deal. And so that's how they use anchoring bias to their advantage. And finally, let's talk about the framing effect. This is the third cognitive bias. And this bias is all about how information is basically presented and how it affects the way we interpret it. It's like framing conversations. It's the same thing, but it's called the framing effect. Here's an example for you. Imagine you're at the grocery store and you see 2 packages of ground beef. It could be ground turkey, ground chicken, whatever you want to call it. One says 80% lean and the other says 20% fat. Which one of those looks, sounds, or feels healthier to you? Most people instinctively choose the 80% lean option as the healthier option, even though it's exactly the same as the 20% fat. See, the way information is framed changes how we perceive it, even when the facts don't change. That's why marketers and politicians love using this bias, the framing effect. It's a powerful tool for influencing your decision. And this is where you have to think through things. You have to ask yourself, is 80% the same, better, or less than 20%? And if you process that information, you'll come up with the answer that, hey, it's the same. It's just how they're framing it, how they're making it sound. So let's tie this back to something we've all experienced, and that's politics, okay, your political beliefs. We just went through an election here in the United States, and, well, I don't need to get into it. We know what we went through. Imagine you believe a certain policy is bad for the economy, for example. With confirmation bias at work, you'll probably gravitate towards news stories, social media posts, or even conversations that support your belief. Hence, if you're on the right, you're going to Fox or some other right-wing news. If you're on the left, you're going to MSNBC or some left-wing news. And what you'll do is you'll ignore or dismiss information that contradicts it. Even if it's credible information, you're going to ignore it. This bias doesn't just affect the politics. It seeps into everyday life, though, folks. Maybe you believe you're not good at relationships. Well, confirmation bias will make you focus on every disagreement or mistake reinforcing that belief, even if it's not the whole picture. Maybe you've had a couple disagreements, but everything else has been fine. But confirmation bias is going to make you focus on that if you believe you're not good at relationships. You have to have that belief first. Then you're going to find things to confirm it. So why does all of this even matter? I mean, why should we care about these biases distorting our perception of reality at all? Well, I'll tell you why. Because understanding these biases is the first step to overcoming them. You see, when you recognize that your brain has these built-in tendencies, you can start to question your assumptions. And questioning is powerful. What it does is it leads to clearer thinking, better decision-making, and a more accurate understanding of the world and yourself. And questioning is powerful. It leads to, basically clearer thinking, better decision-making, and a more accurate understanding of the world and of yourself. So imagine what would change in your life if you stopped letting these biases dictate your reality. I mean, how many opportunities would you see? Could you see? And how many false limitations would you break free from if you didn't have these biases? I mean, you're going to have them, but if you can recognize the biases for what they are and understand that they exist and that, you're looking past them. Ask yourself, how many opportunities do you think you would see and not miss? And that's an important question. And speaking of breaking free, what we're going to do in the next part of today's episode, we'll explore practical strategies to identify and challenge your assumptions. Because when you start questioning what you think you know, that's when real growth happens. Let's dive in. Okay, here's something to think about. How much of your daily life runs on autopilot? I mean, from how you approach your work to how you interact with loved ones to even how you think about yourself. So much of what we do is based on what is known as unexamined assumptions. But here's the problem, folks, with that. You see, assumptions are often invisible, and they guide us without us even realizing that they're there. And unless we pause to question these assumptions, they can limit us in ways that we don't even see. So how do you break free? By learning to identify, challenge, and explore the assumptions that shape our lives. Let me walk you through how this works, okay? The first step is simply to ask, what am I assuming to be true? I mean, just ask yourself, what are you assuming to be true? Think about a situation where you feel stuck. Okay, maybe you're in a job you don't love or you don't like at all or you hate, but you feel, you can't leave because it's too risky. Or maybe you assume you'll never be good at something because, you've maybe failed at it before. Start by identifying the beliefs that are driving your behavior. For example, if I change careers, I'll fail. That's one belief that's driving a behavior. Or maybe I'm not creative enough to start a business, or my partner should always agree with me in a healthy relationship. Yeah, I'm not sure how good that one is. If you have that belief, good luck to you. Okay. But what I want you to do is write it down or say it out loud. Giving the assumption a name is the first step, people, in breaking its hold over you. So once you've identified the assumption, the next step is to challenge it. Okay. Ask yourself, what if this isn't true? Or what evidence supports this assumption? Or what evidence contradicts it? Actually, you should ask all three of those. You should ask, again, what if this isn't true? This assumption isn't true? What if this evidence, or what evidence supports this assumption? Or what evidence contradicts the assumption? For example, let's take the belief, if I change careers, I'll fail. What evidence supports that? I mean, think about it. If you're in that situation and you want to change careers in your middle age or even younger, what evidence supports the fact that you're going to fail? I mean, maybe you've struggled with change in the past. Okay, well, that's fair. But what evidence contradicts it? Maybe you've adapted successfully in other areas of your life. Maybe you've learned new skills that could, make a career change possible. You see, challenging the assumption forces you to see the full picture, people, not just the negative narrative your brain might be stuck on. And we tend to be that way. We tend to gravitate towards the negative. But you have to challenge the assumption. And then finally, you have to ask yourself what other perspectives or explanations might exist for this. Let's stick with the career change example. Instead of assuming you'll fail, what if you reframed it as, I have the ability to learn and adapt so I can succeed if I approach it step by step? I mean, this is where creativity comes into play, and everybody's creative. So don't even start going down that road. You're not creative, because that becomes another assumption. So creativity comes into play here. When you explore alternatives, you start to see possibilities where there are only limits before. And you can apply this to relationships as well. Let's say you assume your partner should always agree with you. Like I said, good luck with that. So exploring, an alternative might mean asking, what if a healthy relationship actually thrives on respectful disagreement? Which I tend to agree. So you see how you switch the script there? Let me give you a real-life example of what happens when you question assumptions. So let's take Henry Ford, the automaker. Henry Ford and the invention of, the moving assembly line for automobile manufacturing, basically. Before Ford revolutionized the industry, cars were, considered luxury items, built painstakingly by hand. And the assumption was that automobiles had to be expensive and time-consuming to produce, which basically made them accessible only to the wealthy. But Ford asked a different question. What if cars could be made faster, cheaper, and for the everyday person? I mean, he didn't accept the status quo. Instead, what he did is he studied existing manufacturing methods, everything from, meat packing plants to watchmaking, and looked for ways to streamline the process. And the result? Well, the moving assembly line. So by breaking down the production into smaller, repeatable tasks and reducing wasted motion, Ford basically slashed the time it took to build a car from 12 hours to just 90 minutes in 1913. I mean, folks, this innovation not only made cars affordable to the average American, but also transformed the way industries around the world approached manufacturing. Now, you might not be reinventing manufacturing, but, Ford's story shows the power of questioning what has always been done and asking, what if this isn't true? What assumptions in your life, big or small, might be holding you back from your potential? Okay, so how do you put this into practice? Well, you start with the small, everyday beliefs that, guide your decisions. Ask yourself things like, in your relationship, for example, am I assuming this person should behave a certain way because of my expectations, or am I open to their perspective? Or maybe at your work, and you might say something like, am I assuming this is the only way to approach a project, or could there be a better method? You got to get ego out of it, folks, because if ego's in it, then you're never going to be able to see a different perspective. Or in your personal goals, you might say something like, am I holding myself back because I believe I'm not ready? which I tend to think a lot of people do? Or is it just that the fear is talking to you that's holding you back for your achieving your personal goals? I mean, what I want you to do is pick one assumption today and go through the 3 steps. Identify it, challenge it, and explore alternatives. It doesn't have to be a life-changing belief, folks. It could be something as simple as, I'm not a morning person. Well, neither am I. But you might discover that with the right habits, like getting to bed early, you can actually be productive in the morning. The point is to start building the muscle of questioning. Over time, you'll find it gets easier to spot limiting assumptions and break free from them, people. Because you see, assumptions are like invisible barriers. They feel real until you question them. When you start challenging your assumptions, you're not just changing your thinking, you're expanding your reality. Okay, up next, what we're going to do is take this a step further with an interactive exercise, basically to test your reality in real time. This is going to be fun, folks, so stick around. All right, now that we've explored how assumptions shape our reality, it's time to put, this into practice. Put our money where our mouth is, basically, with some hands-on exercises. So what I want to give you are some tools to actually see how your brain processes information and how questioning those processes can expand your perspective. So let's start with a fun and exciting experiment called the Stroop test. And then we'll dive into a reflective exercise to shift your perspective in real-life situations. First, the Stroop test. And here's how the Stroop test works. Imagine you're looking at a list of words. Okay, these are a list of written words, and each word spells out the name of a color. So like red, blue, or green. These are names of colors. But here's the trick, folks. The color of the ink that you're calling out doesn't match the word. So the word red written might not be written in blue ink, or green might not be written in red ink. Your task? Here's your task, okay? Name the color of the ink, not the word itself. I mean, it sounds simple, right? But trust me, folks, I've done this before many times. It's a lot harder than it seems. I mean, your brain automatically wants to read the word because that's the dominant process. It's what you've been trained to do your entire life. For example, if you see the word red written in blue ink, your brain wants to say red, but you need to override that instinct and say blue. That's where the challenge comes in. So what's exactly happening here? Well, the Stroop test demonstrates the limits of your brain's automatic processes. What it does is it shows that your brain is, wired to take shortcuts. It tries to process information quickly based on familiar patterns, like reading the words. But when those patterns are conflicting, your brain has to slow down and work harder to resolve the mismatch. And in that moment, you can actually feel your mental gears turning. I mean, it's like you got smoke coming out of your ears. Basically, it's like a glimpse into how your brain filters and prioritizes information. And doing this test, and I look up a Stroop test. I'll have a link on my in the show notes as well for that test. But this test, the Stroop test, it's a great reminder that just because your brain automatically jumps to a conclusion doesn't mean it's the right one. And with practice, you can train yourself to pause, question, and choose a response instead of reacting on autopilot. All right, so now let's take this idea and apply it to real life with a simple exercise I like to call the perspective shift. This is a chance to look at a recent situation through a different lens and challenge the assumptions, you brought into this. Think back to a recent argument, disagreement, or a decision you made maybe recently. Maybe it was something at work, a conversation with a friend, or even a family member, or, maybe it was a decision about your personal goals. Okay, you have it in mind? Good. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to guide you through 3 questions. You can think through them now or jot them down to reflect on later. And if you're driving, don't do this while you're driving. Pull over somewhere or wait till you get home. I don't want you crashing the car. So first, you're going to start by identifying the belief or expectation you brought into the situation. For example, let's say you had an argument with a friend. Maybe your initial assumption was they're upset because they don't value my opinion. Well, write that down. Next, you're going to look at the facts. What evidence do you have that your assumption was true? And just as importantly, what evidence suggests it wasn't true? And using the same example, you might realize your friend seemed distracted or stressed before the conversation even started, which could contradict your assumption that their frustration was directed at you. It could have been something else. And finally, step into another perspective. Imagine how your friend might have experienced that same conversation. I mean, how did they experience the conversation that you had? Or you could pretend you're a neutral party or third party watching the situation unfold? What might they notice that you didn't? And this is where real growth happens, people, when you step outside of your own reality and consider alternative narratives. You see, maybe your friend wasn't upset with you at all. They were dealing with something personal and simply needed space. That perspective exists. But sometimes we just jump to conclusions, right? And we just make these assumptions, and then this is where more argumentation begins and more fights and stuff. But here's the thing with this exercise. It's not about proving yourself right or wrong. It's about basically opening up the new possibilities and breaking free from the automatic stories your brain tells you. And what I want you to do is try this with any situation where you feel stuck, whether it's, a tough conversation, a career decision, or even how you view yourself. The more you practice, the better you'll get at questioning your assumptions and expanding your perspective. And these exercises aren't just the beginning. Once you start testing your reality, you'll see how much power you have to reshape your reality. And that's what's really important, is you want to go from where you are now with your assumptions and begin to question them and reshape your reality so that you're more open and understanding about your reality and those around you. All right, folks, up next, we're going to talk about why this matters, how questioning your assumptions can lead to better decisions, more creativity, and deeper sense of personal growth. Okay, let's pause for a moment, folks, and ask the big question. Why does any of this even matter? Why should we spend time questioning assumptions and challenging our version of reality, after all? I mean, I'm always going to ask why things matter, because it's important to understand why we are doing any action. But here's the answer why it matters. Because the way you see the world shapes everything. Your decisions, your relationships, your opportunities. When you question your reality, you don't, basically just see things differently. You live differently. You open doors to growth, creativity, and connections that you never realized were there. First, let's talk about decision making. When you start questioning your assumptions, you stop reacting on autopilot and start making intentional choices, basically. So instead of being influenced by biases or outdated beliefs, you can base your decisions on, clarity and understanding. Think about a tough decision you've faced recently. How might that decision have been different if you'd paused to challenge your assumptions? I mean, what possibilities might have opened up for you? Next, questioning your reality basically unlocks your creativity. So when you let go of rigid assumptions, you free your mind to explore new ideas and solutions. Think about innovators like Henry Ford or Steve Jobs. They questioned assumptions about what was possible and pushed the boundaries in ways most people couldn't even imagine. You don't have to be a tech mogul or a manufacturing mogul to do the same thing. You just have to ask, what if things could be different? Okay, now let's bring it closer to home, your relationships. Assumptions can create invisible barriers between people. So when you assume someone thinks or feels a certain way without asking, you limit your potential for connection. So by questioning your assumptions about your partner, for example, or your friends or your colleagues, you open up space for empathy and understanding. I mean, you might realize that the disagreement you thought was personal was actually about something entirely different. Or that person you thought was distant was just going through a tough time. You see, challenging assumptions makes room for stronger, more meaningful relationships. And we tend to do that often, don't we? Where we assume something about a person and we don't get clarity about it, and then we react in a certain way. And it's often negative. We don't want to talk to them. We get rude. We're distant, whatever the case is. So you want to challenge your assumptions because, again, like I said, it makes room for a stronger, more meaningful relationship with people, better connections. And finally, questioning your reality makes you, more adaptable. The world is changing faster than ever, and it's constantly changing. There's so much going on in this world. And the ability to rethink, unlearn, and grow is becoming one of the most valuable skills anyone can have. So when you're willing to question your assumptions, you can pivot when life throws you a curveball, basically, to use a baseball metaphor. And you can basically let go of what isn't working, embrace new opportunities with confidence. And this, folks, all ties back to growth mindset. The idea that we can always learn, adapt, and improve. People with a fixed mindset cling to their assumptions because, they see them as part of who they are. But those with a growth mindset, they're willing to challenge their beliefs because they see every challenge as an opportunity to grow. Challenging your reality isn't always easy, and I'm not saying it is. and it can feel uncomfortable to let go of your old ways of thinking. But it's in that discomfort that real growth happens. And you've heard that. To grow, to be successful, you have to get out of your comfort zone. And that's what you're doing here by challenging your reality, challenging your assumptions. You're creating this discomfort so you can grow. Let me share a powerful story about someone who redefined their reality under unimaginable circumstances. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist and a Holocaust survivor who spent years in Nazi concentration camps, basically enduring and suffering most of us can't even fathom. Now, while everything in his objective reality was basically bleak and dismal, Frankl made a conscious decision to redefine how he experienced his reality. He found purpose in his suffering by focusing on what he could control, his perspective. See, he realized that while he couldn't change his circumstances, he could choose how he responded to them. And that's important. We often don't respond well to our circumstances when we're in situations like that. But you see, it was that shift in perspective that allowed him to endure and later thrive, becoming a pioneer in existential psychology and inspiring millions through his book, Man's Search for Meaning. You see, Frankl's story is an extraordinary example of how questioning one's reality, even in the darkest moments, can lead to profound growth. And we've seen the same thing with prisoners of war. They're making adjustments on how they viewed their circumstances in order to survive the ordeal of being captive, just to get through that. So what does this mean for you? It means that every time you question an assumption, you're giving yourself a chance to grow. So whether it's a small belief about what you're capable of or a larger narrative about how the world works, questioning opens a door to new possibilities. And that's why this matters, because every time you expand your reality, you expand your potential. Okay, folks, now that we've explored why questioning your reality is so powerful, let's take action. Because doing all of this and not taking action is pointless, right? So in the final part of today's episode, I'm going to challenge you to start breaking your barriers one assumption at a time. All right? Stay with me. Okay, let's take a moment to reflect on, what we've uncovered in this episode. Basically, your reality, it's not fixed. It's shaped by your perceptions, your assumptions, and the shortcuts your brain takes. So when you start challenging those assumptions, you unlock the door basically to new possibilities. And we talked about how cognitive biases can distort your view of the world, how assumptions limit your potential, and how powerful it is to question those assumptions. And by doing so, you can improve your decision-making, enhance your creativity, strengthen your relationships, and adapt more effectively to life's challenges. So the bottom line is this, folks. When you challenge your reality, you're not just thinking differently, you're living differently. So here's my challenge for you today or tomorrow, whenever you do it, but do it soon. I want you to pick one assumption, just one, something that you've been carrying about yourself or the world, and question it. Maybe it's something about your abilities, your relationships, or even what success means to you. And I want you to ask yourself, is this assumption really true? What evidence supports or contradicts this assumption? And what changes when I view it differently? Take the time to dig deep, and you might be surprised by what you discover, people. Hey, if you've enjoyed today's episode, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a review, share your thoughts, or tell me about the assumptions you're questioning. And if you know someone who might benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Let's spread the word and help more people break their barriers, because the more we challenge our realities, the more possibilities we create. Hey, thanks for spending time with me today on Breaking Barriers. Remember, you have the power to rewrite your story one assumption at a time. And until next time, take care and keep questioning your reality.